Hello and welcome to the Disciple Making Podcast, where we're all about helping Christians become disciple makers. I'm your host, Brad Mann. So today we're picking up on the third step in the disciple making pathway, which is equipping. But before we go any further, it's really important for us to define what we mean by equipping, because in my experience, equipping in a church context has often meant like we need information transfer, we need courses, we need things to help you know what to do. But equipping is so much more than information transfer. Equipping is about the practical impartation of skills, experience, and knowledge, which enables disciples to begin to do the work of ministry. Equipping is about helping your disciples to use their time, their talents, the things that God has given them, and their treasure, the resources that they have for the furtherance of the kingdom of God. So remember the 3 T's: time, talents, and treasures. How are we helping disciples use time, talents, and treasure for the kingdom of God? Now, it's an incredibly important part of the disciple making pathway, but it's also important that we do this at the right time in the development of our disciples. If we look again at Jesus as our model, when do you notice Jesus' disciples actually doing ministry? If you have to read the Gospels, go through the Gospels, where do you see evidence of the disciples doing significant ministry? Apart from some early baptism that seems to happen in John's Gospel, the first time we really see Jesus entrusting his disciples with ministry is about halfway through Luke's Gospel, in Luke chapter 9, where Jesus sends out the 12 to actually go and do ministry. This is part of what we mean by equipping. And why is that? Why does it take half of the gospel before we see this? It's because Jesus needed to take the time to develop his disciples into the capable agents of ministry that he needed them to be. Otherwise, he was going to spend half of his time putting out fires that had been caused by his disciples that weren't yet ready to do the work of ministry that he called them to. So it's important that we do equipping with those who have been sufficiently built in the character and the priorities of Jesus. But, this is a big but, I need to say this. Don't let that fact become your excuse, because in my experience in the church, we do this all the time, and we as Christians, not as the church leadership, but as Christians. We allow the fact that we know that it's important for us to be developed to a certain point before we do ministry to be our excuse to not do ministry. And that excuse cloaks our fear. It cloaks our inferiority complex. It cloaks our failure to prioritize the mission of Jesus above other things. But it's not good. It's not what God has called us to. And we need to deal with our fear. We need to deal with our inferiority. We need to deal with our poor prioritization. We need to fix those things. We need to be built up so that we can go and do and be equipped to do. Equipping should be done with disciples who have sufficiently progressed through the build phase. And there's always going to be more that we're going to be growing in our character and our priorities so that they mirror Jesus' life. But nonetheless, there comes a point where we've done that sufficiently so that we can and should progress into being equipped for the ministry that God has called us to. And sometimes our churches are not particularly excellent at doing this. And that's where you, as the individual disciple maker, can play a critical role in the life of your disciple. So that's what we're going to talk a bit about today. What role can you play as a disciple maker in making sure that your disciples get equipped to do the ministry that God has called them to? We're going to look at this role that you carry, and a simple acronym, ATM, right? Assess, train, and mobilize. So let's look at these 3 things: assess, train, and mobilize, one at a time. Let's start with assess. And what we're saying here is assess is really, we're talking about helping people discern their calling. So assess someone's calling, help them to discern the specific calling, the specific ways in which God desires to use them in their life. And so there's a couple of different things that you do at this stage of the journey with your disciple. And the most important in the beginning is just to experiment and to expose. Right? In this early stage, experimentation is your friend. Find opportunities that exist for ministry, because as your disciple gets involved in doing opportunities to do ministry, they begin to discover passions they might not have realized previously. They begin to find desire that God has placed in them. Play tag along. where you invite your disciples to come along with you as you do A, B, or C, or invite them to go along with someone else as they go and do ministry with someone. Utilize your church, chat to your ministry leaders, find spaces where your disciples can get involved and just be exposed to different areas of ministry in the kingdom of God. Allow that exposure to fuel their fire and passion that already exists in their heart. So step number 1, expose and experiment. Then the next thing you can do is to explore with your disciples. Take some time to sit with them, to chat with them, discuss what are the things that really interest you. Where are the places that you're really excited? What passion do you have? What brings you alive? I mean, I remember for me, before God called me into full-time ministry, I remember I had a day job. I worked a 9 to 5. And if someone had to say to me, Brad, what brings you alive? It was, well, the time I get to volunteer at the church where I get to help plan events for our young adults. Like that's what I lived for. I went to work to do my job, but I lived for the involvement that I had at the church. So what passions do they have? What are the things that bring them alive? What are the things they think about in their spare time? What are the things they want to see grow? What are the places where they're dissatisfied at the moment and want to see changed? What passions do they have? What gifts do they have? What ministry gifts has God given them? And often, if you're talking to a younger believer about gifting, this is something we're all quite timid about. Many of us don't know what our gifts are. I remember doing an experiment in our life group, and we began to say, guys, we want to see the gifts of the Spirit that God has given to each of you being manifest and brought in our small group context. And I remember as we began to discuss that, there was like crickets in the room. And people didn't feel like they could say, this is who I am and this is the gift that God has given me. A, because it feels like you're blowing your own horn, but also because actually we don't always know what that is. And so one of the things we did as a small group was we got each person in the small group to take some time and to pray and to think about each other person in the group and just to write down some of the stuff that they saw of God in that person. And as people received those different things from all the different members in the group, they began to recognize, wow, a lot of people are seeing these gifts in me. And it allowed people to recognize some of the things that they had been given from the Lord. If you can happen to hear some funny noises in the background, that's just my dog chewing on a hoop. So this is real life, people. This is where we're going. All right. Let's carry on with Explore. Down ministry gifts, look at their past experiences. Where have they been previously involved? How have they found that involvement? Talk through some of that stuff. Talk about the abilities that they have. What do they believe that they have? What do they believe they're skilled in? What do you see in them? Often people don't recognize their own strengths. We're slow to call out our own strengths. And sometimes just having someone else say, I really see this in you, can really affirm that in someone else, in your disciple. Use your contacts that you have. Do you know people in the church? Do you know people that are serving the Lord in different spaces? Connect your disciple with them. Allow them to be exposed at that level. Are there courses that are going on at the moment that you could get them involved in that will stimulate some of their interest? Allow them to be involved in it. Examine their temperament. The way in which we are wired affects the calling that God places on our life. If you're going to be a counselor, then it's important that you have a mellow disposition, that you're able to sit and listen, that you're able to value other people speaking. If you just want to talk all the time and you don't listen well, counseling is probably not for you. All right, so explore with them. Explore their calling. Evaluate with them. This is the next step. And this is really important. Do deliberate and honest, like performance appraisals or debriefs. As they've been exploring different things, as they've been experimenting, sit with them. How did they think that went? How did they feel about it? What fruit do you see through it? What fruit have you seen in them as a result of this experimentation? What fruit have you seen in others? So we've got to be honest, Jess, because this is something we don't like to do in the church, because it can mean saying, I didn't think this was your A game. But ultimately that's really helpful, because you are helping people recognize where this is where I am actually good, and maybe this is not so much for me. And you can help them to process that, discern that together, and get a clearer picture of how God's called them to be involved. Sometimes the box that the church creates doesn't fit with the individual, and they need someone to affirm that and say, That these things, that maybe not you, but when you do this, how does that connect with your heart and your soul? So we evaluate with them, we help them debrief and appraise the things that they've been involved in. And then we tap into the wider church body, because other people are affected by the stuff that we carry. And so who do you see who's been affected by your disciple? How can you help them see the impact of what they're already bringing into the lives of other people? Does your church have a prophetic ministry? If you're a charismatic church and you believe in the gifts of the Spirit, do you have people in your church that operate in the prophetic? Will they be willing to come around and just to pray prophetically over your disciple? Perhaps that it will call stuff out in the Spirit that will encourage your disciple in what God has given them to carry. So step number 1 as a disciple maker, to equip your disciple to assess and help them to discern what God has given them to carry. What is their calling? Step number 2 in equipping process, and this is the, I would say, the majority of the equipping process, is to now train your disciple for effective ministry. And when you talk to the average pastor about equipping, it's this part, it's the training part. And specifically, we think in training via course. Right? That's what we consider to be equipping. But equipping, again, is more than that. It starts with a sense, it moves to train. But how we train our disciples is incredibly significant. So I want to talk first about paradigm. Right? Because the paradigm for training is not information transfer. That's not the paradigm. That's something that we can do as a part of training, but it's not the paradigm. The paradigm is something I want to offer to you, is called process training. That's the paradigm for training that we want to do. It's what we see Jesus doing with his disciples, and it's what I believe we need to be doing with our disciples. And process training, it's a 6-step paradigm, and it involves me slowly releasing you into doing what you're being trained to do. Let's say you want to grow your disciple in deliverance prayer ministry. All right, let's say that's something that is important as a part of the equipping that you want to do with them. That's part of the area that you've identified in their life that they want to use that in the way in which they serve God. So let's talk, what does process training mean? Well, process training starts and says, okay, I'm going to do the ministry and you watch. So you can see this happening in the life of Jesus. When Jesus goes and does ministry to the demoniac at the Gerasenes, you'll see that the 12 disciples are all there. Jesus does all the work. They just stand around, they watch, they observe, they see what happens. Right? So that's step 1. I'm going to do the ministry. I know how to do the ministry. You watch me. You observe. And then step 2 is, okay, we're going to level you up a little bit now. So I'm still going to do the ministry, but I want you to help me. There's this part that you can carry. So let's say we're going back to our deliverance training. You know, when we get together, I'd love you to just explain what deliverance prayer ministry is. So I'm going to greet the person, and then you're just going to explain what we're going to be doing together, and then I'm going to pick it up from there. So you invite your disciples to pick up little pieces of responsibility that are usually smaller, less significant, but it begins to get them involved in the kind of ministry that you're doing. Then step 3 is, now we're going to do it together. So this time we say, okay, we're doing our deliverance prayer ministry. You do the welcome. I'll do the explain of what it is. You begin to facilitate the time. I'll do this part, and then you can close in that part. And we share the ministry out together. And this doesn't have to be, these aren't one-off instances. Right? We're not talking about you do 6 training sessions and then it's done. But this is the process that you go on, that you develop together. Step number 4 is, okay, now instead of me leading, I'm going to let you lead. You carry, and you tell me where I can help you along the way. And along each of these steps, remember, we're evaluating afterwards, we're debriefing afterwards, we're explaining and looking back, and we're working to get better together. All right. Step number 5 is, now instead of me helping, you're actually just going to do it. I'm just going to watch. I'm just going to be that guy sitting at the back, and then afterwards we're going to say, hey, how did I do? And we're going to talk it through together. And then step 6, now this is the final step. Your disciple is going to do it, and instead of you watching, someone else is going to watch them. And they're going to begin to repeat the process and train that person to carry it. So that's process training. And that's the paradigm that we want to do our training with. We want to slowly impart responsibility, ministry responsibility to our disciples, reflecting with them as they go, giving them insight, giving them wisdom, encouraging them, building up their confidence, because this really gives practical ministry training. It's not just like, go listen to this material and now go and do. that we're working it through with them. Right, so that's our paradigm. How do we now do training? So there's a couple of different ideas, and there are many different ways in which you can do training. These are 5 ideas that you can use. And the first one is this: use everyday teaching moments. If you're spending time with your disciple, then you're going to have opportunities to see things that happen in the day that are going to enable you to do training. You're going to be able to reflect on moments and experiences and use shared experience to highlight important kingdom priorities or truths. Right? If you're busy working on something, you're busy doing process training in an area, and a moment comes up and a moment gets missed or a moment gets used where something happens. So let's say let's continue our deliverance ministry training. Let's say you're having a conversation with someone and they express a challenge that they're experiencing in their life. And as the disciple maker, you're in that space and you can say, hey, you know what? And as they've shared, you recognize maybe there's actually something else behind that. And you can lead into, hey, do you know about deliverance prayer ministry? Then you've got a moment. Now you reinforce that back with your disciple and you say, did you notice what I did there? Right? Or conversely, you're in a conversation and that happens and they don't bring it up. And then you say to them afterwards, hey, I want you to notice what we could have done there is we could have done A, B, and C, and it would have drawn them into this. Right? So everyday teaching moments. Use everyday teaching moments. Secondly, you're going to need to do some specific teaching. This is the part we normally call equipping, right? It's just this one part, but it's specific information transfer. Sometimes they're going to be courses that are critically important. They're super valuable. They're going to give you good information. Use those courses. Find that consumable content that you need to do, but go through it together, reflect on it together, unpack it together, bring it into the process training. So it's not just I study the course and then it's done, but I'm studying the material and I'm busy practically doing it with you together. We're doing things. And let me just say as well, you as the disciple maker might not be able to do all the training for every area in your disciples' lives, but you might be able to connect them with other people who are living and walking in that area, who can do the process training with them in that particular space. So again, tap into your church resources, tap into the people that are around you that are already doing these kind of things. Okay, specific teaching. Number 3, short-term mission trips. All right, short-term mission trips are an age-honored tradition. They're a great place to grow boldness, to grow faith, to grow confidence. In a short-term mission, you pack months of experience into just 1 or 2 weeks. And so you can really fast-track certain growth areas. Obviously, one of the real challenges with short-term trips is you come back and you're removed from that ministry context. And to keep the fervor and the fire alive that exists in a localized context like that is a challenge. But that's the challenge that you can pick up as a disciple maker. Again, you work on its process training. So it doesn't just end in the mission trip, but it is done part of that training. It's opened stuff up for you, and now you can take it further from there. All right. Short-term trips. Use weekend retreats. Option number 4 for training. So there are great spaces where you can recenter on God. You can re-emphasize listening and focusing on the Lord. You can do strategic planning. You can do team building. You can use those spaces to focus and do specific training with your disciples on stuff that you're doing. It's a great space to, again, build shared experience, build shared ministry experience in them. And finally, evaluate. Do evaluation often. Have meetings where you get together and you reflect on how things are going, on where they're progressing, on where they're struggling, where they can be helped. Ground those times in prayer. Use those times to reflect, to analyze, to adapt, and to improvise, and to build and to grow what God has been doing. That's training. Finally, the last part of your role as the disciple maker in the equipping phase is to help mobilize your disciple for ministry, because this is the goal. This is where you want to get your disciples to. Right? Even if we don't have disciple making as a framework, if you're going to be a good minister in the church, this is what we want to do. As pastors, this is what we want to do. We want to equip the saints for the work of ministry. Right? Ephesians chapter 4, that's where we want to be. And so we want our disciples to be living ministry, doing ministry in their lives, where they've understood who they are and they've found how they can specifically live out God's calling for their own lives. And that calling that they have is going to fulfill His mission. Now, let me just say something to unpack this a little bit. We're not going to unpack it as much as the previous two, but just to unpack this. Mobilizing disciples for ministry is not just filling a volunteer space in a church ministry. It might involve that, but it's not limited to that. I want you to think kingdom. I want you to think bigger than church ministry, church structures. Think kingdom. Ask this question: how are your disciples using their time, their talents, and their treasure to advance the kingdom mandate, to make disciples at home, at work, while they're studying, among their friends? That's where we really want to see fruit. That's what, if this doesn't bleed over into any area outside of the church, then we have failed as disciple makers, because disciple making is something that we are doing all the time. It's who God has called us to be. It's the reason we're here. And so it's got to happen in these different spaces. And so we have got to, as disciple makers, be looking to make disciples and equip disciples to be advancing the kingdom mandate at home, at work, at study, among their friends, in their spaces, where they have influence. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm a pastor, right? And so I want to see people serving in the church. I want to see that. But where we've done our equipping right, we haven't just created a volunteer that's serving in a system. We've created a disciple who is making disciples wherever God gives him influence. And that's going to trump volunteerism every time. Let me illustrate what I mean here. Let's say that your disciple is serving in kids ministry at your church. Right? Now that can go one of two ways. You get those who come and they faithfully do the ministry that they're charged with. They faithfully do kids ministry. They prepare lessons for the kids. They entertain the kids while they're together. And the kids have a wonderful time doing the kids ministry that they're doing, be that a Friday night ministry or a Sunday morning ministry. But there's a good program, there's good input, and the kids enjoy themselves. That's great. You've got a good volunteer. A disciple maker that's been equipped to be living disciple making. Whilst they are doing those things, whilst they are running good programs and giving good teaching, they are also looking to train up the kids. They're looking to impart into those kids the same work that you've been doing in their lives. So they're not just doing good stuff, but they're building those relationships. They're cultivating strategic growth in the lives of the people that they're looking and saying, who are the few among the many that I get to go further with, that I get to build into? How am I connecting with the parents so that I can encourage them to pick up and to continue what God has been doing in Johnny's life? That's where your volunteer becomes more than a volunteer. They become a disciple maker. They're taking ownership for the ministry. They're wanting to see the kingdom advance in the lives of the individuals that they have the opportunity. It's not just how do I sow widely, but who are the few among the many that God has given me grace to influence. Okay, that's equipping. That's the theory of equipping. Next week, if you join us, I'm going to be chatting to Shane. Shane is one of our elders, and Shane has done a lot of work in missions in his life. He's done a lot of work in disciple making, and he's going to be talking to us about how he lives out this role in his life. So come and join us next week for that. But as we wrap up, I want to bring you back to this question that we asked quite a long time ago in the podcast. And the question is very simple. Do you have a disciple? Can you say, these are the people or the person that I'm discipling? Really want to ask you that question. Because if God has called us to make disciples of all nations, it's not okay that we can't answer that. So who are you discipling? Do you have a disciple yet? Think about it. Pray about it. Seek the Lord. And go and speak to people. Go and invite them to join you on a disciple-making journey where they seek to become more like Jesus. If you have a disciple, are they in this stage? Have they reached that point where their character and priorities have been sufficiently molded to be like Jesus? Not perfectly, but sufficiently molded to be like Jesus, so that you can be doing equipping with them. If you can, how can you be working with them to help them be equipped so that they will be the kind of disciple that Jesus is looking for? I love you to think about that. I love you to think, how can I bring, assess, train, mobilize? How can I bring these aspects into my disciples' life? How can I help them discern the calling that God has placed on their life? How can I help to train them in that calling? How can I do process training with them to make sure that they are being actively equipped to do the ministry that God has called them to? If your disciple is not in the equipping phase, maybe they're still in the build phase or the win phase, you're still working on them coming to know Jesus, have you developed a strategic plan? Have you thought about how you're going to help them go from where they are to where they need to be? And what about you? Is someone equipping you? Are you in this space and you really need to grow in your equipping? Have you found someone who's going to be able to help you take you on this journey. Friends, as always, I'd love to hear your stories of how you're doing your best to live this out. So please get in touch with me. If you've got something to share, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me, brad@connectchurch.org.za. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast or sharing this podcast with a friend or someone that you're discipling, so that together we can become more like Jesus. Until next time, may God bless you and give you wisdom and insight as you seek to labor with Him and equip those that He's given you the grace to influence. Ciao for now. Bye-bye.